So lovely to have you with us here on stage. First question will be really on the obstacles. What obstacles are companies facing when it comes to funding the green transition?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Maeve, and thank you for having us. I think at Oliver Wyman, we are delighted to partner again with CDP to publish this report, Getting the Money Moving. And as part of this research, we analysed over 1,600 companies that represent 89% of market capitalisation in Europe, so really good representation of the economy there. And we saw a lot of progress, right? We saw a lot of progress on adopting emissions targets. We saw progress on developing transition plans and also the emissions reductions themselves. But we also saw an implementation gap. And that is based on a framework that we looked at analysing those companies across 5 factors. So one is steering the business, looking at capital expenditure, decarbonising the supply chain, engaging with customers, and low-carbon product innovation. And the finding from the reports was that only 1 in 5 European companies that we looked at actually was making substantial progress in actually implementing transition plans. And you could ask, why is that? And one of the reasons that the European companies actually cited was access to capital was a key issue and a key concern in implementing transition plans. That's over a third of companies identified that as a problem, and actually nearly half of companies in the most capital-intensive sectors, the most carbon-intensive sectors that require the capital transitions, that's utilities, oil and gas, transportation, identified that as a concern. So we're seeing, actually, when we deep dived into some sectors, some of that playing out already. So in steel, which accounts for like 5% of European carbon emissions, we saw that the current investment gap there, if extrapolated forwards, would mean that there could be a 30% shortfall between the supply and demand of green steel in 2035. And in electric utilities, again, we estimated that around 1.9 trillion euros worth of investment is required to actually bring about the transition by 2030. Wow. But given the investment shortfall that already was observed in 2022, again, if we extrapolate that forwards, that could lead to a 285 billion gap in 2030. So, you know, lots of gaps highlighted, but also lots of opportunities that we can look to address as well.
Indeed, and beautifully articulated there. Congrats on remembering all those figures. Just on the report, we've seen how fundamental economics, they're just not moving fast enough when it comes to supporting change at scale. Why, do you think, and what are the solutions?
Yeah, I think there are challenges on both sides when we think about investment, when we think about funding. So both on the company side and on the financial institution side. I think on the company side, what we've seen is that in many kind of new green business models, the actual kind of profitability, the economics are currently not as attractive. They tend to be a little bit riskier. And actually, when asked, the companies cited challenges themselves, such as longer time horizons for return on investment, changing and uncertainty policy and regulatory environment. We heard earlier about, you know, some kind of bureaucracy and lengthy times for applications and so forth. And that's kind of generating some issues on the company side. Now, on the financial institution side, what we have seen is many financial institutions, so 2/3 of the companies that we looked at, they said they were making active steps to transition to net zero. But we are still seeing that gap, right? And what is creating that issue? Some of the economics there are kind of still not quite making sense to really scale that transition finance. And some of the issues cited by financial institutions are around the fact that some of those investments are still quite large, the time horizon's very long, some of those new technologies are not yet commercially proven or very dependent on policy. And so while they're engaging in some of this new activity, they're still kind of proving it for themselves as they're building those capabilities.
And I imagine you have a lot of recommendations as well in that report. Can you tell us some of them?
Yeah, I mean, without going into all the recommendations in the reports, which I'm sure you'll all find when you read it, I think really coming out of this is a call for collective action. You know, companies, financial institutions, policymakers, they all play a role, and it really requires an ecosystem approach to move the economy. We saw some really nice examples doing the analysis. So one example is between a utilities company, a brewing company, and a steel producer, where the utilities company facilitated the heat transfer from the steel producer to the the brewery and optimized all those processes. But we also see that actually a lot of this is also very dependent on policy change, right? Like creating the incentives, creating a stable policy environment. If we look at the automotive sector, that's one of the most powerful prototypes for this. Like, how can a new green business model actually really revolutionize a sector? And you can point to a lot of that, to the fact that there's the European ban on internal combustion engines by 2035. And when you look at the numbers, even though currently sale of EVs are only 13% of new car sales, already we're seeing that over 60% of R&D in that sector is in EV over the next 5 years. So we're seeing that policy certainty and direction actually allowing companies to lean into those areas and allowing the investment to flow behind it.
Wow, fascinating stuff. And of course, everyone can download that report by just using their badge and scanning the QR code, and they'll have access to that full report, which is fascinating. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us and for telling us all those details.
Great, thanks very much, Maeve.
Jennifer Sim there from Oliver